2 years ago today, one of the most dangerous mercenary organizations in human history launched a march on Moscow. They were well armed, hell-bent on bringing their enemies to heel, and across the span of hours before their attack was aborted, they crashed through barriers, brought down helicopters, and threatened to bring Russia to her knees. They were known as PMC Wagner, a mercenary army that spent a decade in operation as the shadow hand of the Russian Federation. Ruthless, bloodthirsty, permitted to operate outside the international rulebook, and relied upon to do the dirty work that Moscow could not do in the open, the Wagner Group was an organization unlike any other on Earth. During the Ukraine war, they swelled in size, sending wave after wave of desperate prisoners into a meat grinder. Around the world, they pillaged, plundered, and curried favor with all manner of despot and dictator in order to advance the grand vision of one Vladimir Putin. And as suddenly as they burst into public awareness, they were destroyed. They destroyed themselves by mutiny, by a mysterious plane crash, and by absorption into the vast Russian military. It's been 2 years now since the Wagner Group launched and aborted its ill-fated mutiny, and where there was once only shadow and mystique, international fact-finders and researchers have finally been able to shine a light. We now know much more about the group's sordid history, its inner workings, its highest authorities, and of course, what happened to bring it down. So, in this post-mortem analysis, we're going to dive deep into what the Wagner Group really was and what it really did. And perhaps, even more important than that, we're going to talk about the parts of PMC Wagner that have lived on and what they're doing today and why, despite the formalities, it may be too early to call this episode a post-mortem at all. Back in May of 2022, we here at WarFronts wrote and recorded an episode on a mysterious group of Russian mercenaries known collectively as Wagner. They operated in the shadows, killing and torturing across continents with apparent impunity, and at that time, it was as if the entire world was oblivious to their existence. At the time we wrote our episode, Wagner was just beginning to flex its muscles as part of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Within weeks of that script being completed, they would gain global notoriety by conscripting thousands of Russian prisoners and sending them directly to their doom in massive human wave assaults. But back then, we didn't know what the Wagner Group would become. They seemed to have a global reach, they seemed to tremendously value their role in the shadows, and they killed journalists. Ultimately, we decided to not release that episode. Turn the clock forward to May of 2025, and the Wagner Group isn't just a shadow of its former self. It's been picked apart, scrutinized, infiltrated, exposed, and to a degree that we would have found stunning, it's been understood. Back then, tracing the Wagner Group across continents was like trying to track down a serial killer, one who mostly knew how to cover their tracks. Today, it's like trying to trace the movements of Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. Some of the details will never be known for sure, but the veil of absolute secrecy has been torn away, never to return. One thing that we may never know and almost certainly won't learn about unless Russia's current regime is replaced by a transparent fact-finding polar opposite is the precise circumstances under which the Wagner Group was founded. But by now, two names have become synonymous with the organization: Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin. Prigozhin, an oligarch and caterer with close links to Putin, would claim in 2022 that he had founded the Wagner Group after nearly a decade threatening legal action against outlets that had accused him of the same. Utkin, a former member of the Russian Special Forces and a known neo-Nazi, is thought to have created or helped to create Wagner in its earliest days and then became its military commander, while Prigozhin financed the group and ultimately became its public face. Both men would die in August 2023 aboard a business jet that crashed under mysterious circumstances, and their personal retellings of the start of the Wagner Group died with them. We do know, with the benefit of hindsight, a few key details that bring us closer to the truth. We know that Prigozhin came into quite a bit of money around 2012 or 2013, so much so that he was able to buy a large compound and several aircraft, and his wife was able to start multiple businesses as well. We know that although his catering business received a contract to provide food for the Russian military around this time, worth the equivalent of $1.2 billion for a year's work, some of that money was siphoned off into other endeavors. We know that in summer of 2013, about a year before Wagner really started popping up, Prigozhin was instrumental in the creation of multiple online disinformation campaigns indicating his growing closeness with the Russian military. We now know, given Wagner's geopolitical and strategic value to Russia and its careful use in areas where its status as a mercenary organization took the heat off Russia for controversial or nefarious activities, that it's far less likely that Prigozhin and Utkin built the group all alone, and far more likely that they did it while acting on the will of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. There, they could act as useful proxies and trusted associates to manage the mercenary group closely while allowing the hidden hand directing the organization to remain in the shadows. We also know that they weren't alone. Anton Yelazarov, better known by his call sign Lotus, joined the group in its earliest days after being kicked out of a Russian airborne platoon. Valery Chekalov, call sign Rover, became the group's head of logistics and would bear primary responsibility for building a highly complex transnational operation in the span of just a couple of years. Anton Vino, longtime chief of staff of Vladimir Putin's presidential executive office, would meet with Prigozhin over 100 times starting in 2012, around the same time as Prigozhin's large influx of wealth, most likely marking him out as Putin's key interlocutor between the Kremlin and Wagner. Ruslan Tsarlakov, Deputy Minister of Defense from 2015 to 2024, played just as important a role, while Timur Ivanov, also a Deputy Minister of Defense, was responsible for placing Wagner across the globe with highly lucrative defense contracts. Sergei Surovikin, a high-ranking Russian military leader known as General Armageddon, held VIP status within Wagner at the same time as he held his post and was likely a key facilitator of Wagner's relationship with the Russian armed forces since the very beginning. Perhaps most important of all was Andrei Troshev, codenamed Sadoy, or Grey-Haired. Troshev rose to the rank of colonel in the Russian armed forces, serving in Chechnya, but was dismissed for drunkenness in 2022 before finding his way into the Wagner Group as its chief of staff, de facto paramilitary leader, and by some accounts, highest internal authority above Utkin and Prigozhin. He leads the remnants of the organization today after his predecessor's untimely demise. Then, as now, one thing about the Wagner Group was known for sure, that its place in the shadows and periphery of global attention was entirely by design. Wagner was a proxy organization acting on behalf of the Russian state, its leader, its military, and its oligarchy, and working to advance Russian interests all across the globe. But critically, Wagner was not under the control of the Kremlin, and it was not organized under the Russian flag, at least not officially. Instead, it was an organization made up of nameless, faceless men who couldn't be tied directly to the Russian Federation, no matter what they did. After all, as Russian leaders would so frequently remind the world when asked about Wagner, private military companies, or PMCs as they are often called, weren't even legal under Russian law. As such, since a PMC like Wagner couldn't legally exist in Russia or be legitimate in the eyes of the Russian state, the Kremlin simply couldn't be in league with them. As the official line went, it didn't matter whether allegations about Wagner were produced by fraudulent journalists, disreputable critics, conniving foreign leaders, or anybody else. Wagner, according to Russia, didn't exist, so Russia couldn't possibly be working through them. Right? Well, look, in reality, the Wagner Group was a smokescreen, a mechanism for Russian leaders to dispatch well-armed and often well-trained paramilitaries into places that would be too complicated, too messy, too potentially damaging to Russia's image, or at times too dangerous to send representatives of the Russian military. If Wagner, say, parked itself on foreign soil and demanded the extraction of critical minerals that were funneled back to Russia, then Russia could count itself the beneficiary of such an arrangement while not being responsible for the process of acquisition. If Wagner fighters happened to engage in atrocities, war crimes, or crimes against humanity over the course of their time abroad, then Russia simply couldn't be held responsible for the conduct of those devilish mercenaries who just happened to be Russian. And if a Wagner fighter over the course of their deployment abroad was killed, then the Russian Ministry of Defense wouldn't need to go to the trouble of recording or reporting a death or drafting a letter to that dead soldier's family. The fighter who had died was a ghost. And since he served with an organization that Russia regarded as illegal, he certainly wasn't Russia's responsibility. At the same time, the Wagner Group in those early days was far more than just a band of armed brigands. It was a network, a vast transnational spiderweb of shell corporations, laundering outfits, legitimate-seeming business fronts, and more, all meant to facilitate the mining, the extraction, and ultimately the trade of natural resources that were typically extracted either illegally or by people under duress. At its heart, organizations under Yevgeny Prigozhin's business empire, the Concord Group, took materials and sums that had been thoroughly cleaned and legitimized before exchanging them with the Russian state in ways that would have checked out if somebody came around to look at the books. At the same time, Wagner was a protection racket, more than happy to swoop into a developing nation, offer its leader both personal protection and help in fighting back against whatever insurgency or rebel group was nipping at their heels, and take, in exchange, the official backing of an entire nation in doing whatever came next. Technically speaking, they were registered in Argentina, although they maintained offices in St. Petersburg, Hong Kong, and elsewhere across the globe. In the early days, Wagner started out with just a couple of hundred fighters, but once they got going, they swelled rapidly in size. Wagner grew to around 1,000 members by or before 2016, and then grew fivefold over the next year and a half, ultimately building a standing paramilitary force prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, somewhere around or above 10,000. And when it acted, even if its mercenaries took their orders from Yevgeny Prigozhin or other internal higher-ups, it acted on the behalf and in the interests of Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. Wagner gave its own orders, but it gave orders that were informed by what had been whispered into its leaders' ears. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. It didn't take long at all for Wagner to spread itself far and wide, but in the first few years of its existence, it was in Ukraine, particularly the eastern Donbass region, where the Wagner Group primarily cut its teeth. The earliest Wagner units were active in Ukraine as early as the takeover of Crimea in February 2014, when they served as additional manpower, backing up Russian army units in what was mostly a neat and quiet takeover. Back then, they were a very small outfit under the direct command of Dmitry Utkin, one of a whole mess of militias, mercenary groups, extremist organizations, and other units that were content to fight for Russia without the formalized protection of the Russian state. After that, however, Wagner PMCs were instrumental in helping to shift Russia's focus to the Donbass, a change that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin would ultimately throw their weight behind, but that didn't seem to be their idea when it first began. Instead, Wagner and other paramilitary groups like it streamed into the Donbass and took up arms alongside a nascent armed separatist movement within the local population, working together to destabilize the region, take over towns, attack important local figures, and force both Ukraine and Russia to engage around a new flashpoint. In the grey zone warfare of the Donbass, Wagner proved itself to be a potent force, with most of their operations only having been linked to Wagner specifically after the passage of considerable time. They took part in the Battle of Debaltseve, where pro-Russian forces utilized incredible artillery bombardment under the command of Utkin himself, who himself would be wounded over the course of the battle. They also took part in fights all across the Donbass, at strategically and locally important political and military locations as pro-Russian groups worked together to consolidate control over the region. They were also chosen for the bloody task of cleaning house inside the pro-Russian ranks, snuffing out and eliminating local commanders who couldn't be trusted, wiping out small mercenary groups that seemed as if they might go rogue, and at one point disarming the entire Odessa Brigade of the Luhansk People's Republic, one of the sham governments that Russia had backed in the region. It was Wagner's hidden hand within the Donbass that ensured that the region's breakaway governments ultimately fell in line with Moscow, and it was Wagner cutting throats and snapping necks in order to prevent any ambitious local leaders from believing that they actually held the power that had technically been invested in them. From the late 2010s until just before the invasion of Ukraine, Wagner forces served mostly as assassins working to destroy all who might stand in the way of Russian ambition. Beyond the nations on Russia's immediate borders, it was in Syria where Wagner really ramped up operations. They weren't the first Russian PMC active in Syria. Instead, that dubious honor went to the Slavonic core of the Moran security group, who had been operating there since at least 2012 and possibly as early as 2009. But when Wagner touched down, they not only absorbed portions of the Moran group, but would ultimately achieve far more than Moran ever did. Wagner were first recorded in the international press in Syria in October 2015, about a month after Russia had begun its military intervention in the war, replacing the Slavonic Corps in areas where Russian PMCs had already been active. At that time, of course, not much was known about them other than the fact that a few Russian mercenaries had been killed by a mortar strike. They'd gotten to Syria on Russian military aircraft, they'd been supplied with weapons through the same convoys of ships that had ferried guns and ammunition to the rest of the Russian and Syrian militaries, and speaking off the record, Russian officials had confirmed that they were working in Syria on Moscow's behalf. Wagner was everywhere in Syria, fighting alongside soldiers loyal to Bashar al-Assad, whether they were facing pro-democracy rebels, Islamic State jihadists, or anything and everything in between. Some of them served as advisors on the front lines, frequently engaging in combat directly and at times taking on operations that were well outside their mandate in an advisory role. They coordinated with Russian and Syrian aircraft, calling in airstrikes and marking targets. But according to some sources, they did a whole lot more, especially in the 2016 offensive on Palmyra. During that offensive, according to Wagner fighters who spoke to the international press, it was Wagner that did the bulk of the fighting, clearing the way and acting as shock troops so that less equipped, less motivated, less knowledgeable Syrian troops could take up the rear and park themselves onto territory that Wagner had actually claimed. At its disposal, the group had all manner of heavy weapons, including main battle tanks, revealing not just the levels of firepower with which they were entrusted, but the considerable expertise that could be sourced from within their ranks. Many Wagner fighters were ex-military, often training each other in all manner of specialized warfighting and more than capable of using whatever kit Moscow was willing to provide. And then, conveniently, they'd lose track of it once it arrived to Syria. Along with that first Palmyra assault, Wagner would fight as part of the second push on the city, although they sustained far higher casualties in that second attempt. They fought in the Battle of Deir ez-Zor, also against the Islamic State as the Palmyra offensive had been, and ultimately succeeded in lifting the siege on the city. They trained specialized units within the Syrian military, including the notorious ISIS hunters, who did precisely what their name would suggest, and later saw some among their ranks join Wagner in operations across the globe. Wagner fought for the control of gas fields, phosphate mines, and other lucrative natural resources, as well as engaging in a number of urban warfare operations nationwide, including in Damascus. Wagner was able to secure deals with the Syrian government, in which the group would directly claim 25% of production from any oil fields or phosphate mines they protected, leaving the leftover revenues to be split in half between the Syrian government and Russian companies on the ground. Over time, Syria grew into a hub for Wagner, to the point that Russian compounds began popping up where Wagner fighters intermingled with civilian workers sent by other Prigozhin companies to come assist with resource extraction. Wagner also drew the very worst sort of international headlines for all manner of atrocities known or rumored during their time in Syria, including the particularly prominent killings of Syrian army soldiers who had deserted the nation's military, who were executed, and who at times had their corpses mutilated by Wagner troops. In 2018, Wagner played a major role in the Battle of Kashan, a very historically significant battle against American and Kurdish-led troops that we've actually published an entire video on if you're interested in checking that out. By some accounts, hundreds of Wagner fighters died in the battle, which was the first direct military engagement between American and Russian troops since the end of the Cold War. Importantly, while that battle didn't go well for Wagner, both the battle and the group's wider deployment in Syria became an important test case. Could Russia get away with continuing to deploy paramilitaries once the world learned about them and realized that they were acting on Russia's behalf? As it turned out, the answer was yes. Rather than calling to arms when they realized Moscow was breaking the rules, the rest of the world proved content to look the other way so long as Russia could provide even a shred of a fig leaf to mask the true nature of its international operations. All across the globe, although many of Wagner's exploits wouldn't be known for years and some will be lost to history, we now know far more about what the organization was up to in those years before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps the group's strongest influence even today is exerted in the Central African Republic, where Wagner has maintained a presence since 2018 at the latest. In the CAR, Wagner is a knife in the hand of dictator Faustin Archange Tudela, who's relied on the organization to provide both his personal security and a form of secret policing and suppression of dissent nationwide. Over 1,000 of the mercenaries have been stationed there for the last half-decade and more, with their numbers suspected to have swelled to 2,000 in recent years. There, Wagner has been accused of the widespread torture and extrajudicial execution of civilians, as they both keep near total control of the nation on Tudela's behalf and guard over highly productive mines that harvest diamonds and other valuable minerals. Over the years, a slow but steady trickle of reports out of the nation have alleged all manner of heinous acts performed by the Wagner Group, everything from routine and violent sexual assaults to disembowelments and mutilation, to the functional enslavement of locals to perform manual labor. Not only that, but they've raised and trained about a dozen military units in the CAR that act in their image, staffed by members of the president's ethnic group and engaging in campaigns of terror while staying true to Wagner's purported motto in the nation: leave no trace. Quoting The Sentry, speaking about that motto, in other words, kill everyone, including women and children. All the while, Wagner has made itself comfortable in the nation, setting up its own compounds, creating local vodka and beer brands, and building the Central African Republic into perhaps the most stable center of Wagner power on the African continent. By some accounts, Wagner remains a mere partner to Tudela. By other accounts, they now functionally run the country. But even though the Central African Republic is Wagner's primary hub in Africa, it's by no means the only one. Over in Libya, Wagner first showed up in April of 2019 when they came to the aid of prominent warlord Khalifa Haftar during Haftar's assault on the nation's internationally recognized government in Tripoli. During the Haftar offensive, Wagner provided hundreds and then over 1,000 much-needed physical bodies in a conflict defined by relatively small numbers of troops fighting in vast, empty desert expanses, and they brought both the operational versatility and the combat experience to be highly effective there. In Libya, Wagner is alleged to have routinely killed prisoners and civilians, including people who had voluntarily surrendered to them, and indiscriminately deployed landmines in civilian areas. They reportedly formed a close connection with the son of deceased former dictator Muammar Gaddafi, Saif, and they brought tanks, advanced radar, drones, and other sophisticated equipment to a war where that sort of hardware could, and did, turn the tides. All the while, they gained control of oil fields, capturing more and more until the vast majority of Libyan oil was in the hands of a Russian ally. It's not clear how much of Haftar's current control over most of Libya can be directly attributed to the work of the Wagner Group, but the answer, sure as hell, isn't none. Notably, Russia always dealt something of a defeat in Libya when Turkey took a similar approach and backed the internationally recognized government with thousands of mercenaries and drones of its own. But although Russia declined to step up its operations and create a real confrontation with Turkey, it was able to play the long game and keep Haftar's forces in control of most of what they'd been able to capture. In Sudan, it's a similar story. Wagner first showed up there around 2017, back when Omar al-Bashir still ruled the nation, offering protection, political support, and military assistance in exchange for the ability to mine gold and the guarantee of a Red Sea port for Russia. As in the CAR in Libya, shadowy firms tied to Yevgeny Prigozhin descended upon the country, taking over and establishing mines, while staffing their security with Wagner mercenaries. After al-Bashir was deposed, Wagner kept up its work in Sudan, cooperating with the new government to train Sudanese troops and intelligence services while facilitating the delivery of heavy weapons to the regime. During the Omar al-Bashir era, Wagner oversaw a disinformation operation to discredit a wave of anti-government protests, and they were active during the protests themselves to try and suppress internal dissent. During the country's ongoing civil war, Wagner has run into some considerable headwinds, at one time being targeted by Ukrainian special forces troops deployed to the nation in order to counter Russia's influence. That pressure, however, has incentivized Wagner to merge its Sudan operations with its Central African Republic outfit, and it's been a motivating factor for Wagner to build the CAR into more of a regional hub. And all across the globe, the same basic story played out again and again and again. In Mozambique, Wagner spent years helping to fight an Islamist insurgency in the northern province of Cabo Delgado, while facilitating weapons shipments into the country and helping Russian state-owned corporations ink contracts with diamond mines and more. Wagner was ultimately replaced in Mozambique by mercenary operators who were more able to fight in the region's difficult landscape. In Zimbabwe, they've been tied to illegal deals around gold mining and influence operations to support the regime. In 2018, Wagner showed up in Madagascar, gaining access to chromium, magnesium, and gold mines, as well as oil, in exchange for its help in an attempt to manipulate the country's elections. That effort was unsuccessful, but Wagner's links with the nation have proven lucrative anyway. This came in the form of a new Prigozhin-linked mining company that still works along state-owned mining in Madagascar today. In the Congo, they've been observed operating in support of government forces in the country's eastern regions, taking advantage of yet another conflict in a now failed attempt to establish control over vital resources. Meanwhile, in Latin America, Wagner showed up in 2019 to support and protest Russian-backed leader Nicolas Maduro, and they showed up again in 2024 to support Maduro in a difficult political period leading up to his latest re-election. Wagner's been accused of operations in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Nagorno-Karabakh, Moldova, Haiti, and even or around the small Chatham Islands off of New Zealand. Often, however, their presence remains difficult to prove and even harder to track in the murky environments where Wagner truly thrives. With the benefit of hindsight, a few things should now be clear about the Wagner Group wherever they show up in the late 2010s and early 2020s. First and foremost, they were far from a simple band of guns for hire. Instead, they brought with them real fighting expertise, the ability to train and arm a nation's own military, and additional services as bodyguards and close protectors of national leaders and their regimes. Second, Wagner invariably shows up in places where there were natural resources to be acquired, whether minerals or oil, or which would entice them to engage in just about any sort of mercenary operation. Third, the violent elements of the Wagner Group were just one aspect of what they were up to, setting up intricate business and financial networks to ensure the thorough extraction of whatever material and monetary value they could. And fourth, they were neither uniformly successful in their work nor uniformly failures. They operated with broad latitude to carry out a narrow set of objectives. They did so with limited resources, and when they ran into obstacles they couldn't get through on their own, there were limits to the amount of support that Russia could provide. Finally, although they were in many ways a global outfit, they were focused almost exclusively on nations that were considered to either be a part of Russia's sphere of influence or up for grabs by whichever global power could entice a fence-sitting nation to play along. Wagner was not a tool to wrest nations out of the grip of Western powers. Instead, it was a tool to build Russia's own global network, far from the prying eyes of Moscow's adversaries. In 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and today we know that Wagner was deeply enmeshed in that act of conquest since the very earliest days of the war. During Russia's years of asymmetric warfare in the Donbass region, Wagner had become a favorite tool for Moscow to conduct sabotage operations, including complex and highly dangerous infiltrations behind enemy lines. Wagner had also proved effective in intimidating the population of the Donbass, and they were known for their ability to rotate combat veterans into the region because of their parallel operations in Syria and Africa, something that smaller and less geographically widespread mercenary groups couldn't match. They were shock troops, acting as the tip of the spear during ambushes and large attacks where their discipline, their organization, and their veteranship made them more capable than most of their fellow fighters at that time. They trained militia organizations in Donetsk and Luhansk. They conducted regular assassinations, both against their enemies and against rogue members of their own side. And just like they did around the world, they facilitated the delivery of weapons, equipment, and information to other troops on the ground. In the year leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Wagner exerted an almost magnetic pull upon its operatives around the globe, drawing them, their weapons, their ammunition, and their comrades in arms to the Donbass in whatever numbers they could, without abandoning their other client states. When it was time to go to war, the Wagner Group's plausible deniability and their ability to take on unique asymmetric operations made them Russia's preferred choice for a particularly unsavory task. Remember, in the months and the weeks leading up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the war that Moscow drew up was worlds away from what was ultimately going to happen. The goal was for Russia to surge into Ukraine in a lightning offensive and use a combination of overwhelming force and shock and awe tactics to break Ukraine's defense, gain compliance, and very quickly force the nation into submission. That, in turn, would be far easier if Russia could cripple Ukraine's ability to react, and it could do that by decapitating Ukrainian command and control structures before the first tank columns even rolled past the border. The dagger that Russia hoped to thrust into Volodymyr Zelensky's heart? Well, that, of course, was the Wagner Group. 400 Wagner operators were flown in from the Central African Republic for the job, according to revelations by Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials after the fact. They weren't the only group charged with making an attempt. Instead, they were in competition with both Chechen commandos and another mercenary group called Redat. Wagner, however, arguably got the closest to success, positioning its 400 operatives inside of Kiev and getting them in position to await a go order to target Zelensky, over 20 other high-ranking Ukrainian officials, and critical sabotage targets that, if destroyed or disabled, would have left an open door for Russia to exploit. Unfortunately for Wagner, they were found out by Ukrainian security forces, and according to Kiev, some 60 Wagner forces in disguise were killed while trying to pass themselves off as part of Ukraine's defense forces. That happened just hours into the Russian invasion, meaning that the go order hadn't yet been given, seemingly in an attempt to time chaos in Kiev so that it would break out just as Russian forces were poised to start an attack on the capital. After Ukraine rooted out that first group of infiltrators, Ukrainian reports suggest that the rest of the Wagner fighters had to attack early, making an attempt to hit a key military base, but they failed, and Ukraine re-established control over its capital. Ukrainian intelligence would reveal a few weeks later that there had been a second Wagner attempt on Zelensky's life, but the details on that attack are murkier. Around the same time, thousands of other Wagner fighters surged into action, pre-positioned all across the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk, and offering their fighting expertise, knowledge of Ukrainian battlefields and defenses, and operational versatility in assisting the Russian military. That meant that Wagner was on hand when Russia's offensive stalled, ultimately failed to reach Ukraine, and had to shift its complexion fast to prevent crippling losses. When Russia realized that it wouldn't be able to carry out its lightning offensive as it was drawn up, groups like Wagner became far more important than their relatively limited numbers would suggest. In the first weeks of the stalled offensive, Wagner fighters helped Russia more firmly establish control over the territory it had been able to capture, taught them the general lay of the land, and made ready for a longer, grinding offensive that would be known as the Battle of the Donbass. According to Western intelligence, it was Wagner that played a leading role in the massacres in the city of Bucha around this same time. During the massacres, as revealed by investigations after Russian forces withdrew from the city, hundreds of civilians were alternately mutilated, burned horrifically, tortured, executed, or shot indiscriminately at range by snipers. The killings were largely carried out by ordinary Russian soldiers, but per the German Federal Intelligence Service, it was the Wagner Group that led the atrocities, presumably carrying out conduct that had become routine for them in the Middle East and Africa. By April or May of 2022, Wagner's pre-war calls for new recruits had paid off, sending higher and higher numbers of Wagner operatives, including veterans of the Russian military, into the conflict. Among their number, according to Ukraine, were Syrians and Libyans who turned up dead during intense fighting in the Donbass. They had presumably fallen in with Wagner during the group's time in each of their home nations and proven capable enough to be a part of Wagner operations in the future. To give an idea of the people that Wagner was recruiting around this time, take the results of the downing of two Su-25 ground attack aircraft in mid-May, one flown by a retired Major General of the Russian Air Force who'd since taken up with Wagner, and another flown by a colonel from Belarus. In addition to experienced veterans, Wagner's hunger for foreign fighters has been made clear over time, and it's since been reported that Wagner nearly reached a deal with Bashar al-Assad to send tens of thousands of Syrians into the group's ranks, half of whom would remain in Syria and half of whom could be sent wherever Wagner wanted. Wagner troops were on the front lines during brutal fighting over a range of Donbass cities, often taking a lead role in bitter urban combat, going house to house when necessary to clear the way for less experienced, less capable Russian regulars. During this time, they took heavy losses of their own, but their importance to the Russian war effort simply cannot be overstated, and their expertise, flexibility, and knowledge of the landscape were critical in helping Russia adapt to a style of war that was fundamentally different from what the Kremlin had been intending. And we mention recruitment by the Wagner Group because it's at about this time that the organization began a practice that drew even greater notoriety than Wagner was used to. That, of course, was the decision to recruit Russian convicts, prisoners who were offered a highly unusual opportunity to put their lives on the line, help the Russian war effort, and either shave time off their sentences or go home free. The bargain was simple: serve for 6 months, survive, and the average prisoner would get a full pardon. Violent prisoners were in high demand, bringing with them an inclination toward war crimes that manages to be both stunning and unsurprising at the same time. But as we well know, looking back in retrospect, these convict fighters were at incredible risk of death or grievous bodily harm, sent into the meat grinder of the Ukrainian battlefield to take part in human wave assaults, often trading their lives in exchange for a benefit to Russia that amounted to just one stopped Ukrainian bullet. We also know more about what life on the front lines was actually like for these prisoners. It was a brutal affair, governed by the same sets of strict rules and hierarchies that dominate prison life in Russia proper. We unfortunately don't have the time to get deep into their experience in this episode, although that would be a fascinating topic in itself, so please do let us know whether you'd like to see that in the future. But suffice it to say that everything from Russian prisons' social caste system, powerful bosses on top, reviled sexual slaves and other untouchables at the very bottom stayed consistent during their time on the front lines, largely because of rules set by the ex-con Prigozhin himself. Of course, they had full knowledge of their status as mere cannon fodder sent into the meat grinder, especially those untouchables and other low-caste prisoners, and they were kept in check on the front lines under the threat of extreme violence by Wagner higher-ups and Russian regulars. With time, they became far less effective, and casualty rates ran even higher as Ukraine learned to anticipate the human wave assaults and mow them down with incredible efficiency. Convict fighters would remain in Wagner service, however, through 2023 at a minimum, and by some accounts, for a good deal longer than that. According to Yevgeny Prigozhin, prior to his death, 50,000 convicts would fight in Ukraine, and tens of thousands would die there. Those prisoners would join with major Wagner elements in the Battle of Bakhmut, a grinding, nearly year-long battle over the city of Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast. Wagner were the tip of the spear in the ground attack on the Bakhmut outskirts, and they were instrumental in the long series of smaller attacks that cut off the city from Ukrainian support. According to Ukrainian soldiers, it was Wagner that typically captured positions using a combination of human wave assaults by convicts and smaller, more capable units that could take advantage of the chaos they had manufactured, acting in a more surgical way to influence the outcomes of those firefights. The high human cost of Wagner's tactics, however, would ultimately be the factor that drove the mercenaries to slow down the pace of their assaults, ultimately running out of bodies to sustain the offensive. Their attention turned to the nearby town of Soledar, where again Wagner troops played a key role in the worst of the fighting. By April of 2023, they'd taken most of Soledar and placed pressure back onto Bakhmut for the next phase of the fighting. It was at this stage of the war in Ukraine, right after Soledar was taken, that would come to represent the turning point for the Wagner Group in Ukraine and across the globe. So before we come to the climax of that story, it's a perfect time to step away from the battlefield and take a closer look at what Wagner had become. We'll start with the people at the very top, because although we've discussed a few of them already, the people involved with founding the Wagner Group weren't always the same ones to play key roles later on. Yevgeny Prigozhin, of course, was an exception to that rule. By early 2023, Prigozhin had taken public credit for founding the Wagner Group, something that, again, he doesn't seem to have done alone or entirely of his own volition. But in 2023, as he did earlier in the group's history, it was Prigozhin who served as a global face for the organization, both representing Wagner as a whole and very capably taking the spotlight off both battlefield commanders and Russian higher-ups behind the scenes. Prigozhin was not a direct overseer of Wagner's day-to-day operations, but instead was a high-level coordinator sitting at the very center of the spiderweb of international deployments, mining and extraction agreements, shell corporations, and government connections that made up the real Wagner Group. Prigozhin's calendars, diaries, and documents have been leaked or obtained in part since just after his death, painting a picture of a man who spent most of his time coordinating operations with the Kremlin, developing strategies with high-level Russian officials, and then passing those orders down the chain for his tactical commanders to figure out how to implement. He rarely met with the highest officials of any Russian ministry, but instead would liaison with their deputies and underlings very frequently, again supplying a thin veneer of plausible deniability for the people directly surrounding Putin himself. Many of the deputies who were closest to Prigozhin would later be purged from the government after Wagner's attempted mutiny, but more on that in a bit. Within Wagner's internal structure, Prigozhin spent an outside proportion of his time working on disinformation campaigns and efforts to combat foreign journalism while leaving the majority of the combat and logistical work to his underlings. He was very much a frontman, focused on driving narratives, managing public relations, and perhaps most importantly, serving as a durable or even enthusiastic lightning rod for criticism that would otherwise have been directed toward more sensitive individuals. On the military side, it actually doesn't appear to be founding member Dmitry Utkin who played the most important role, but Andrei Troshev. He would become central to Wagner's combat operations across the globe, taking a close and detailed interest in Wagner missions in each nation where its fighters were deployed, especially Syria and the Central African Republic. By Prigozhin's calendar logs, it was Troshev who worked with him the most and who thus would have been the main conduit for Russia's battle plans and objectives to be made into actionable directives for the mercenary group. That's not to say that Utkin was irrelevant, however. Instead, he was a key coordinator of Wagner's field operations, getting his hands dirty on assignment at times and typically serving in a role where it would have been his job to manage tactics while Troshev managed security. It's an imperfect distinction, but one that does well enough for now. I've talked about the Russian political or military leaders who kept ties with Wagner, the Shoigus, the Surovikins, or the Salakovs, who appeared to be in on the game but were formerly part of the Russian Executive or Ministry of Defense, not Wagner. But what we haven't talked about is the company that served the same role for Wagner's sprawling network of shell corps and other assets. That would be Rostec, the sprawling state-owned conglomerate that makes up the bulk of Russia's military-industrial complex. Rostec was the key conduit for arms and military equipment to flow into the hands of the Wagner Group, including not just guns and bullets, but rather advanced kit that set Wagner apart from other forces in most environments where it was active. The conglomerate also served as a financier, investing through its subsidiaries in the same industrial projects that allowed Wagner to extract mineral wealth and other natural resources from other nations. Rostec also supplied many of the arms and hardware that Wagner delivered to its partner nations and dealt with many other Russian firms that would play a role of their own in Wagner operations. Then, on the Wagner side, there were the group's many officers, commands, detachments and subsidiaries, all running through a central conduit in St. Petersburg. That was Prigozhin's home city, and it was where Wagner ran its largest office, overseen by Prigozhin, his son Pavel, and Valery Chekalov, the head of Wagner's logistical operations across the globe. Also based in St. Petersburg were the so-called Council of Commanders, a group of over a dozen key leaders alongside Troshev and Utkin, who handled everything from individual detachments abroad to individual areas of expertise, like the use of drones or heavy weapons, to tacticians who worked across battlefields and missions. They in turn oversaw hundreds of highly experienced military veterans who were enticed to Wagner with better pay, interesting assignments, and, at least prior to Ukraine, not a terribly high risk of getting killed. As researchers from New America describe in their immensely valuable Future Frontlines project on the Wagner Group, the organization, quote, mirrored a military formation modeled after an airborne special purpose or Spetsnaz brigade. It included a range of its own specialists, everyone from tank operators to artillery operators to reconnaissance troops and more. That made for an internal structure that could mix and match specific operatives, pair them with military equipment that both suited their expertise and matched the environment they'd be going into, and send them into the field with confidence that their on-the-ground commanders could handle business most of the time. In that sort of environment, ambitious self-starters and versatile, adaptable operators were a prized commodity, and innovation of all kinds, including the macabre, the totalitarian, and the downright sadistic, were prized if they could advance the overall mission. In practice, they typically deployed in assault detachments, 3 assault platoons of infantry-style fighters, plus armored support, fire support, snipers, medics, reconnaissance, and logistics and transport specialists. A handful of complete detachments would deploy to a given nation, and individuals within those detachments could, at times, rotate and try out different responsibilities if they'd earned the trust of their superiors. And speaking of the troops who made up the bulk of Wagner deployments, although they certainly weren't all the same, there are some generalizations we can make, especially when we factor out the convict recruits used in Ukraine. Those fighters aside, the typical Wagner fighter was one with at least some military experience, sometimes with prior experience in another militia or PMC, and with significant enough knowledge of actual combat that they were not a liability. Often, they were drawn from ideological groups, particularly far-right extremists, including white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Wagner's ties to neo-Nazism, as well as the Russian imperial movement, Red Novery, and other ideologies are well documented, although the degree to which those beliefs were a part of the group's identity rather than a common fixation for their soldiers, that's somewhat more in dispute. With regard to their fighting caliber, the myth that Wagner fighters are particularly elite compared to warfighters across the globe is just that, is a myth. Instead, Wagner's operating principles in battle weren't rooted in their fighters' status as the best combatants worldwide. Instead, they operated on the premise that most of the time they would be the best combatants on a particular battlefield. In that regard, they were special operators in most battle environments, similar to how, say, Somalia's Dinar Brigade of Special Forces can't go head-to-head with Navy SEALs, but are more than competent enough to whoop al-Shabaab whenever is necessary. Whether Wagner troops were fighting against local insurgencies, established rebel groups, or in multidimensional environments like the Syrian Civil War, they could usually expect to go head-to-head with units that range from the halfway decent to the mediocre to cannon fodder. Only rarely would Wagner find itself fighting opposite an enemy that was as experienced, as well-trained, as well-armed, or as willing to partake in the horrors of war, and it was very rare that Wagner would meet its match in all of those areas at once, especially before the full-scale war in Ukraine. Unfortunately for Wagner, the times when it was outmatched, like in the Battle of Kasham in Syria or in certain Ukraine engagements, these could be catastrophic and highly embarrassing. Those instances are rare enough, however, that they've typically been dismissed as isolated incidents. Most of the time, they were powerful enough to operate with near impunity, and at times, they've grown so powerful that they can even keep their own client governments in line. So let's return to mid-2023, near the height of the Battle of Bakhmut, where, after around a decade in operation, the Wagner Group appeared to be hitting its breaking point. Depleted of convicts, forced to draw more and more of its talented fighters into the deadly Ukrainian meat grinder, Wagner was already up against it when a yawning fissure began to open up between the mercenary group and the Russian Ministry of Defense. What happened next was the subject of both a wave of international headlines and, at the time, considerable confusion. The Russian Ministry of Defense was, allegedly, not supplying nearly enough ammunition to Wagner forces, not because the ammunition wasn't available, but because MOD leaders like Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov were withholding it. Not only that, but according to Prigozhin, Shoigu and the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, had struck a deal. If and when Wagner fighters were killed off or forced out, Chechen forces would take over in their place. As Prigozhin told it, breathlessly and on repeated fiery videos distributed on social media, Wagner troops were condemned to die without the ammunition they needed, and the Russian MOD knew it. Tensions continued to rise for weeks, with Wagner repeatedly threatening to withdraw from their positions if ammunition wasn't provided, and the MOD repeatedly stretching Wagner thin before coming in with just enough ammunition to keep them happy. By mid-May, Prigozhin was accusing Russian troops of abandoning Wagner in battle, and by the month's end, after both Wagner and the Russian government claimed they'd taken Bakhmut for good, Wagner was in the process of withdrawing its positions and handing control back to the Russian military. Western intelligence suggested that by this time, Russia had also told Wagner to stop recruiting prisoners, and the Ministry of Defense was actively working to ice out Wagner and Prigozhin-friendly officials, lest they assume too powerful of a role within Russia. By summer, the situation between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense was deteriorating rapidly, with Prigozhin levying myriad accusations against MOD incompetence and ulterior motives to undermine the mercenary group. Finally, in mid-June, the Ministry of Defense appeared to win the internal Kremlin conflict against Prigozhin and handed down orders that the Wagner Group was to subordinate itself to the Russian military. For Prigozhin, and much of the Wagner Group, that was a bridge too far. Although at the time of the group's attempted mutiny on Moscow, it seemed like a sudden decision by Wagner to rise up, we now know in hindsight that the preparations began around the same time that the integration order came down from Shoigu. According to Western intelligence, reported after the fact, Wagner operatives began moving their units and equipment closer and closer to the Russian border, eventually massing in such volume that a large-scale revolt appeared imminent. According to US intelligence, prominent Wagner allies in Moscow knew in advance, including General Armageddon himself, Sergei Surovikin, the Butcher of Syria. Far from what much of the world had assumed as it was happening in real time, the target of the Wagner uprising wasn't Vladimir Putin, but Shoigu and Gerasimov, and given Wagner's connections in the Kremlin and the MOD, the long-term play may have been to replace those key leaders with the same Wagner-friendly generals who seemed to know the rebellion was coming. Shoigu and Gerasimov would be visiting southern Russia, very close to where Wagner forces were massing, and after Prigozhin made an appearance at an important meeting of the Russian Duma, Wagner would make its move. According to Western intelligence, Russia's internal security services were able to find out about the uprising with time to spare, and though it was an uncomfortably close call, they were able to take significant enough action that Wagner had to respond. Just like their attempt to assassinate Zelensky in Kiev at the start of the war, Wagner was forced to move before it was ready. How the FSB was able to make the connection, that's not known for certain, but one factor to consider is that of Andrei Troshev. After more than a decade working directly alongside Prigozhin and Utkin, Troshev split with the group in the days before the mutiny. At the time, it was a move that brought Troshev considerable backlash from within Wagner's own ranks, but it paid off in the long run. It was Troshev who was placed in charge of the group's remnants under the Ministry of Defense by direct order of Vladimir Putin, and thus it was Troshev who arguably benefited most of all from the Wagner mutiny. Was that a carefully calculated move by Troshev, who saw Prigozhin and Utkin about to go rogue and threw his lot in with the other side? Or was it pure coincidence that Troshev left in disgrace and thus made himself the only person in Russia with both experience leading Wagner and minimal association to the attack on Moscow? Or was it a power play, with Troshev seeing that Prigozhin and Utkin had gone too far, selling them out to Moscow and taking their place once the mutiny was stopped? The real answer is that we just may never know. As for the rebellion itself, well, it was as spectacular as it was brief. After releasing a video to the public that was fiery even by his usual standards and made accusations that the entire invasion of Ukraine was based on a false premise engineered by the Ministry of Defense, Prigozhin surged his forces into southern Russia. Notably, Prigozhin's claim wasn't that Vladimir Putin himself had misled Russia, but that Shoigu, Gerasimov, and an inner circle of oligarchs had convinced Putin to start the war based on false pretenses and false reports. Once that and a few other messages went out, Wagner forces moved on the strategically critical city of Rostov-on-Don, the forward staging area for Russia's offensives in Ukraine, and a location where Wagner could start a drive up the M4 highway directly to Moscow. Wagner took control of the city with little to no resistance, and a massive column of troops and armored vehicles advanced on Moscow, bringing down helicopters and command and control planes, capturing an airbase, and according to reports on the ground, coming within fewer than 100 kilometers of Moscow itself. But Russian forces were ready to respond, and although they appeared taken aback by the scale and ferocity of the Wagner offensive, they were able to get into position on time. A column of Chechen fighters pressured Rostov-on-Don from the west, regime-friendly forces tore up portions of the M4 highway, and Moscow was barricaded rapidly, with the Russian military taking up defensive positions on the Oka River, where the furthest advance of Wagner troops was positioned just along the river's southern bank. Sergei Surovikin was seen in a clip resembling a hostage video, appealing for Wagner to stop its attack, and thus indicating to Prigozhin and other Wagner leaders that at least part of their plan had been found out. And while small elements of the Russian military are believed to have deserted their posts and joined in the Wagner assault, the number of defections were nowhere near what Wagner seemed to be counting on. Judging by the plan that Wagner seemed to have concocted, one of the three factors they were counting on, a successful advance on Moscow, allies in the Kremlin to help their cause, and mass defections by the Russian military, they might not have needed all three, but they certainly needed at least two, and without allies in the Kremlin or mass defections, the advance was doomed. The precise circumstances under which the march ended, they're not currently known at the time of writing, but the broad outlines of the deal are easier to establish. In exchange for backing down, Wagner troops would not be harmed or retaliated against, while Prigozhin himself would be allowed to leave with his men. The deal was brokered through a series of high-level Russian officials, as well as Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, who gave his recollection of the discussions during a speech to his nation. Quote, "I said, Zhenya, no one will give you either Shoigu or Gerasimov, especially in this situation. You know Putin as well as I do. Secondly, he will not only not meet with you, he will not talk to you on the phone due to this situation." Prigozhin was silent at first, but then burst out, "But we want justice. They want to strangle us. We'll go to Moscow." I said, "Halfway there, you'll just be crushed like a bug." Wagner headquarters was raided, the families of its leaders were reportedly used as leverage to gain compliance, and Wagner fighters withdrew from Rostov-on-Don as expected, ultimately taking up positions in occupied Ukraine. Russian leaders explained that Prigozhin would go to Belarus and that neither he nor his fighters would be prosecuted, while Wagner would be absorbed into the MOD. Crackdowns and purges followed. Prigozhin continued to plead his case on social media. Vladimir Putin finally admitted that Russia had been funding Wagner all along, and by mid-July, Wagner had basically ended its participation in the conflict in Ukraine, moving many of its operatives to Belarus. Finally, after reported direct meetings between Putin and Prigozhin in Russia, the end of the Wagner Group in its original form was made permanent. On the 23rd of August 2023, a private jet carrying Yevgeny Prigozhin, Dmitry Utkin, and other important Wagner officials crashed in Russia, allegedly, although not definitively, shot down by Russian air defenses. During both its time in the shadows and its time in the spotlight, the Wagner Group has made a profound impact on the modern world. In Russia, it was a critical national security asset that became a critical national security threat. In Ukraine, it was a scourge and a way for a foreign invader to rewrite the rules of both low-grade conflict and all-out war. Across the developing world, it was a shadow hand, a critical element in building Russian hegemony and establishing control over the natural resources that both make the world go round and make their owners rich. And in the West, Wagner was a curiosity, a menace, and to those who paid attention, a wake-up call, a unique and innovative way to take advantage of the fundamental flaws of the international order. Wagner's demise would lead to major change in Russia, both at the top and across the nation's military. Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister who Wagner tried to bring down, would be escorted out of his post in 2024, with control given to one Andrei Belosov, a technocrat and economist who had past links to Wagner and a keen understanding of how a group like that could extend Russian influence around the world. Wagner itself would be rebranded, subsumed to the Russian military, and made into the Africa Corps, although the specifics of the transition are complex, and for our purposes today, it's just a bit boring. At the same time, other elements of Russia's armed forces have learned from the Wagner Group, adapting parts of their model and approach to warfighting that were effective, and using those lessons learned as they continue to fight against Ukraine. The organization itself was cannibalized in the wake of the mutiny, not dismantled completely, but deprived of experienced commanders who were sought after all up and down the Russian military for their experience, connections, and personnel. Some Wagner veterans have gone on to fight alongside the Chechens, others integrated to Russian special forces, and many were picked up to work security on behalf of Russia's state-owned megacorporations. Around the world, other countries have picked up on the value of having a Wagner Group in their back pocket, and they've begun to organize similar mercenary outfits to fill a similar role. Some of these have cropped up under the direct instruction of Wagner itself. Take a group in the Central African Republic, Wagner Tiazande, made up of ethnic Azande militants who've used their Wagner training to terrorize villages, fight on behalf of their country's dictator, and even clash with South Sudanese forces in battle. The nation of Turkey has developed similar organizations, most prominently a private military company known as Sadat that's showed up everywhere from Syria to Nagorno-Karabakh to North Africa in support of Turkish interests around the world. China has started up PMCs of its own, with as many as 40 or more believed to be operating abroad, often in close proximity to projects related to the Rising Powers Belt and Road Initiative. The United Arab Emirates relies heavily on PMCs abroad, expanding into many of the same African nations as Wagner. Iran-backed paramilitary groups appear to have learned lessons by observing Wagner, changing the way they operate to more closely mirror Wagner procedures. Mercenary leader from Eastern Europe, Horetu Potra, has earned the dubious moniker of the Romanian Yevgeny Prigozhin after leading a company of hundreds of Romanians in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in a similar, albeit unsuccessful, fashion. And although, after the events of 2023, the Wagner Group no longer technically exists, the organization's combat units are still deployed across the globe to the same nations and often the same sites where Wagner has been active for years. The organization's internal command structures on the ground, its imagery and internal traditions, and its global assignments have all remained untouched. And there's been little, if any, of the drama and internal strife of the Prigozhin era. According to some current and former fighters who've spoken to the global press, Wagner actually operates in parallel to the Africa Corps, although the truth of that distinction is somewhat murky based on publicly available information. Formalized or not, though, Wagner has remained distinct, and it's maintained its position as Russia's best option to operate in higher-risk environments where newer Africa Corps branches don't go. If the Wagner Group was a person, then practically the only thing that's changed since 2023 is that they're now wearing a hat that says, "Not the Wagner Group." For that reason, please do forgive the decision to discard that Africa Corps label for the rest of this episode. Over the last couple of years, Wagner has kept its position in Belarus, using the territory of a third nation and the hospitality of Alexander Lukashenko to train its fighters and maintain a logistical base. It's showed a distinct willingness to comply with the Russian Ministry of Defense and has been disinterested in rallying behind the people who their prior leaders probably would have referred to as successors. Prigozhin's son, Pavel, a prominent commander named Anton Yelazarov, call sign Lotus. Without a brash, confrontational spokesman to keep the world's attention, the organization has slipped comfortably back under the radar, and now, relieved of most of their duties in the Ukraine conflict, they've been retooled and optimized for what might have been their greatest area of strength all along. Indeed, the Wagner Group has continued to expand its reach globally, especially in the Sahel region of Africa, just south of the Sahara. There, Wagner has leapt into the gap left behind when several Sahel nations booted their prior security guarantor, France, out of the region after military coups overthrew their prior governments. Although Wagner was active in Mali as early as 2021, the group has picked up operations and increased troop deployments dramatically after the death of Prigozhin, also expanding into neighboring Burkina Faso. After several hundred Wagner fighters arrived there in early 2024, another neighbor nation, Niger, decided to agree to the same, and within months, a first batch of Wagner troops arrived with an air defense system in tow. Wagner's time in the Sahel hasn't been easy exactly. In Mali, violence has skyrocketed after they arrived, with clashes getting more fatal, rebels and jihadists notching major successes, and dozens of Wagner troops slaughtered in July 2024 in a joint ambush by Tuareg separatists and jihadist extremists in the country's north. Nonetheless, the actions of those same regional governments would seem to suggest that Wagner is satisfactory, at least for now, despite their failures. Mali actually fought the Russian Ministry of Defense directly in 2023 after Wagner's mutiny, when the MOD attempted to withdraw Wagner unilaterally and replace it with a PMC that's directly subsidiary to the government, but Mali refused and insisted that Wagner stay. Perhaps as confirmation that Wagner's performance is still meeting expectations, the organization has only continued to expand its reach throughout Africa. They've deployed hundreds of troops to Equatorial Guinea in 2024, offering personal protection and military training to a nation that spent decades putting on a masterclass in appeasing Western powers while allowing horrific levels of repression against its own people. In Wagner, we will likely oversee the transfer of power in Equatorial Guinea when 82-year-old dictator Teodoro Obiang eventually dies and passes control of his nation to his son and chosen heir, Teodorin. In Chad, they've purportedly been used to funnel support to rebel organizations looking to destabilize the nation and overthrow its president, while in neighboring Sudan, Wagner has partnered with the UAE to help funnel weapons into the nation and fuel its ongoing civil war. Wagner has now been reported in Libya guarding a construction operation to build a deep water port under the guise of creating a resort, and it's allegedly maintained its presence in the Congo despite that country's civil war, extracting gold and other minerals through a network that leads back to Cameroon. And speaking of Cameroon, the nation recently faced protests by truckers who accused Wagner of assassinating a truck driver who was part of operations to supply critical imports and aid to the Central African Republic. In the CAR, by the way, Wagner remains as strong as ever as they support the nation's leader in his quest for a third term despite anti-Wagner protests by the country's political opposition. Finally, although nothing is official yet, don't be surprised to see Wagner pop up in Asia's Myanmar after Russia signed agreements with the country's military regime to build a small-scale nuclear power plant, an oil refinery, and a seaport along the current coast. Despite its expansion, Wagner does face considerable challenges. Its recruitment numbers have been faltering ever since the mutiny, with Russian military veterans more exhausted, more frequently wounded, and less willing to join under the Africa Corps banner than they had been when the group was advertising as Wagner. Abroad, a small but meaningful group of adversaries seem to have their number when it comes to combat, especially jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Their foreign partners at times report frustration with Wagner and its fighters' inclinations to engage in all sorts of human rights abuses, at times so horrific that by comparison, even groups like the Islamic State start seeming like the good guys in the eyes of the locals. Militaries that partner with Wagner tend to get harder to control, emboldened by the conduct they see from Wagner fighters and inclined to replicate it, while at the same time not reaching nearly the level of success in fighting extremists that their regional leaders were hoping for. And perhaps most important of all, the organization faces a major logistical challenge now that the Assad regime in Syria has fallen, meaning that the pathways by which Wagner has gotten new fighters, equipment and ammunition for years are no longer secure. We covered Russia's Syria problem and their path to a potential fix by setting up alternatives in Libya in a separate episode on the 26th of March, if you'd like to learn more about that. But despite its setbacks and despite its continued limitations, the Wagner Group today might be the most potent version of the group that's ever existed. Now, potency isn't the same as capability. Certainly, Wagner's lesser numbers and the deaths of so many experienced troops mean that it probably can't do all of what it could do in its heyday. But the version of Wagner that exists right now is streamlined, focused, and operationalized in a way that it never was under Prigozhin and Utkin. It's able to operate in the shadows with a high degree of efficacy, finally earning the trust of Russia and its leaders now that its loose cannon elements have been dealt with. It's spread across the globe, bringing tested battle tactics and a suite of other services to offer its clients while being well aware of just what it can and cannot get away with. It's not under pressure to produce results in Ukraine, but instead to operate in what's always been its true wheelhouse, in these global deployments of a few hundred or a couple of thousand of troops of most. Arguably, it even controls a country, the Central African Republic, while being more than able to operate with impunity and full regime backing in several other nations. It's working with a Russian Ministry of Defense that's finally able to learn from it, now that the bravado and confrontation of the Prigozhin era is a matter of history, and its value has been appreciated by a wide range of other world nations that now seek to replicate Wagner itself. Probably, it'll never again rise the level of fame it attracted in 2022 and 2023, but for an organization like Wagner, that was never the point. Instead, the Wagner Group has matured into the quintessential 21st century PMC, light-footed, highly versatile, willing to do the bidding of its state backer, and enthusiastic about indulging in the extreme and violent methods that a nation cannot formally be attached to. It's just as capable today as it ever was, far better optimized to carry out its mission, and established for the long term in partnership with well over a dozen client states all around the world. We called this episode a post-mortem analysis. Indeed, Wagner 1.0 is long gone. This new version of Wagner, shaped and purged and shaped again by the trials of the last decade, is very different. And this time, the Wagner Group seems like it's here to stay. Thank you for watching.